Alright, so on Sunday mornings we've been having this on-again, off-again series on the book of Hosea. This morning I wanted to look at Hosea chapter 11. Hosea chapter 11. Out of Egypt I have called my son, is what I've called the lesson. And up to this point, really kind of looking at the various parts of the book of Hosea and leading up to this, we talked last time, I discussed this about disappointment. God's great disappointments with His people, Israel. For example, in chapter 9 and verse 10, He says, I found Israel as grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers as the earliest fruit on the fig tree in its first season. But they came to Baal Peor and devoted themselves to shame, and they became as detestable as that which they loved. Imagine God's disappointment. He finds Israel, they're like grapes in the wilderness, like the earliest ripe figs, and then they disappoint Him. They put themselves to shame. And so the section concludes in verses 16 and 17 with Ephraim being stricken, the root dried up, and there is no fruit. Again in chapter 10, he begins it by saying Israel is a luxuriant vine. He produces fruit for himself. The more his fruit, the more altars he made. The richer his land, the better he made the sacred pillars. So, he has all this prosperity, this fruit, and he uses it to make these idolatrous altars and these sacred pillars. And so, of course, what happens is they've used their gifts for idolatry. Again, they've proven themselves to be a disappointment to God. Ephraim is verse 11 of chapter 10, Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh. What have they been doing? Well, they've been sinning from the days of Gibeah. They've plowed wickedness. They've reaped injustice. They've eaten the fruit of lies. And so, as a result, judgment comes upon them. And so we saw those three cycles of disappointment, each in turn. But here in chapter 11, we have yet another. In chapter 11 and verse 1, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to the idols. And yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of a man, with bonds of love. And I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws. And I bent down and fed them. They will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be their king, because they refused to return to me. The sword will whirl against their cities and will demolish their gate bars and consume them because of their counsels. So my people are bent on turning from me. Though they call them to the one on high, none at all exalts him. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. For I am God and not man, and the Holy One in your midst. And I will not come in wrath. They will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And therein lies the first instance of God expressing His hopes for Israel. As any parent expresses hope for their child, hope that their child will grow up to be something better, I guess. Realize a potential or something like that. And in fact, this description of Israel as God's son is itself drawing on language from the law of Moses. In Exodus chapter 4, for instance, in verse 22, Moses was told, Thus you shall say to Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, Let my son go, so that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Again, in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 31, a similar description of God with Israel in the wilderness. It says, But in the wilderness you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, and all the way which you have walked until you came to this place. And again, in Deuteronomy chapter 14, talking more collectively here, it says that you are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shall you shave your forehead for the sake of the dead, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for His own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Israel was God's child. They were His son. He called them out of the land of Egypt to make them mature, to make them a people for His own possession. And like a parent has expectations for their son, God had expectations for Israel and His son. He wanted them to be holy as He is holy. He wanted them to imitate their father. And what happened? Hosea 11 verse 2. The more they called them, the more they went from them. Now, who is the they? Of course, that's the difficulty that we see in verse 2. Who is they? We would expect God to be the one calling. You would expect it to say, the more I called them, the more they went from them. And so, some have suggested, for instance, that they, being the prophets of God, that were calling them. Still others have suggested a different rendering. The English Standard Version, for instance, says that the more they were called, the more they went from them. In other words, the more that God was calling Israel, the more that God called out Israel, the more that they departed from Him and turned away from Him. And there's certainly a lot more discussion that could go into that. And the point is, of course, Exodus is not the only time that God called Israel. Yes, God called them out of Egypt, but He kept calling them over and over again. The Lord calls out to Israel, saying, here is rest, here is repose. We were in the Psalms class, we were talking in the psalmist's frustration. I call out to you day by day and night by night, God, and you don't answer me. Well, how does God feel? The fact that He calls out to us day by day and night by night, and, we don't do a good job answering Him either. Who has the real problem with reception? Humanity does. And throughout, God sent prophet after prophet, proclaiming to them, saying, return to me. He's been calling to them throughout history. And when God called Israel, did they come to Him? Did they draw near to Him? No. The more they called, the more they went from them. And they kept sacrificing to, not Yahweh, the Baals. They kept burning incense to idols, it says. Even though God called Israel, Israel decided to run from God and pursue Baal instead. And pursue these idols of the nations. These idolatrous practices. So what did God do? Verses 3 and 4, it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms. But they did not know that I healed them. It's like, we've seen this scene before, if you've been a father. Fatherly love is charmingly portrayed in a scene that any family would recognize. Here we go, the father's teaching his son to walk. And what does his son do? Well, the child runs away. Instead of coming to him, the child departs from him. He carries his son, like He carried them in the wilderness, as we read in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 31. In Isaiah chapter 40, the similar image is described of the shepherd who takes his sheep in His arms. In Isaiah 40 and verse 11, the Lord says that like a shepherd, He will tend His flock. In His arm He will gather the lambs and carry them in His bosom. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. Well, here God takes up His son in His arms. He carries him. But what happened? Israel didn't know. They didn't know that He healed them. In verse 4, I led them with the cords of a man, with bonds of love. I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws. I bent down and fed them. And verse 4 doesn't sound like it's talking about a child anymore. It sounds like it's talking about an animal instead. Leading them with cords and bonds, removing the yoke, bending down to feed them. So we have this kind of, as Hosea frequently likes to do, mix his metaphors with the metaphor of a son and a livestock. And of course, this isn't the only time in Scripture that you actually see these two ideas mixed together. The very opening of the book of Isaiah, for instance, does the same thing. Isaiah 1 in verse 2 and 3, listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth, for the Lord speaks. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. They're like my children. They're like the ox. But you know what the difference between Israel and the dumb animal is? Well, the dumb animal knows who their master is. Israel can't seem to figure that out. That's the same idea here. God says, I led them with the cords of a man. I wasn't abusing them. I was giving them, I removed the yoke. I fed them. I provided for them in every possible way. He looks at the burdened animal. He doesn't cause it to work harder. He gives it rest. He lifts its yoke. He feeds it. What happens? Well, they forsake Him. They turn from Him. They go from Him. They plow unrighteousness and wickedness and reap injustice. So what happens in verses 5 through 7? Well, it's the same pattern that we've seen throughout Hosea. God condemns them to exile. And they will not return to the land of Egypt, although, and here we see, this, is God going to send them to Egypt? Is God going to send them to Assyria? That's been a question throughout Hosea. At this point he says they will not go to Egypt, they will go to Assyria. He will be their king. Makes it explicit. Although I have to put an asterisk next to explicit because there are translation issues with this verse. If you want to see them, put it in the question box. Israel gets, but the main point here is Israel gets their just deserts for being constantly torn between Egypt and Assyria. Make up your mind. If you're not going to do it, I'll make up your mind for you. You ever be in that situation as a parent? Your child can't decide what two things they want. It's like, if you don't decide soon, I'm going to pick for you. Well, here, Israel's like, well, we want to be with Egypt. Oh, well, we want to be with Assyria. We want to be with Egypt. And finally God says, I'm going to pick for you. You're going to Assyria. You're not going to like it either. Make up your mind already. I really wish you'd pick the right thing, which was neither of those. But Israel didn't understand that lesson. And in fact, this passage is playing on the idea of return. They will not return to the land of Egypt. But Assyria, He will be their king because they refuse to return to me. Over and over, this word for return pops up quite a bit. It says in verse 7, it's the same term, my people are bent on turning from me. They tried to turn to Egypt, but they're not going to turn to Egypt, they will go to Assyria. They wouldn't turn to me, they were bent on turning from me. Because Israel had appointed kings without God, they get a godless king, Assyria. Because Israel had refused to let God be their king, Assyria will be their next king. They will be consumed by the sword, eaten by the sword, literally. And then in the end of verse 7, though they called them to the one on high, because the New American Standard Bible sometimes speaks English never as man has spoken it before. Perhaps what we're looking at, and if you compare the versions on it, it says a couple different things. The New King James says, though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt Him. In other words, they're calling out to God, but they're not really trusting in Him. They're not really exalting Him, so their call is meaningless. On the other hand, the ESV has it as, though they call out to the Most High, He shall not raise them up at all. In other words, they're calling out to God, but He's not going to listen to them. Which effectively, they end with the same result. And again, we get into a lot of technical discussion as to which is the case. In either case, the people's calling is doing nothing for them. Just as God's calling to Israel seems to be doing nothing for Him. And you think about it, God's been calling out to Israel and they haven't responded. Well, fine, they're going to call out to me. I'm not going to respond to them. Because it's not a real call. It's not a sincere call. And the end result, we could end at verse 7 and it would end like every other section. God condemning them to judgment, abandoning them and saying, that's it. I've had it with you, Israel. I'm done. I'm walking away. But that's not where the passage ends, funnily enough. And this time, the disappointment section ends a little differently. In verses 8 through... which is why this is its own sermon. In verses 8 through 11, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. Herein now we see kind of the first faint glimmer of hope. But even though Israel has done all this stuff, and even though God is about to reject Israel, we have this question. How? How can I give you up? Because let's face it, is this not the dilemma of every parent that is forced to deal harshly with their child, to discipline their child? This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. You ever hear your parents say that when you were growing up? I always thought they were lying. I'm revising that thought now. Think about God. You read the Old Testament, you read the Bible in general, you see all of these sweeping judgments, these destruction, these curses of the covenant, these condemnations. And then you read a passage like this in Hosea 11. And it's almost like God is saying, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. Because God actually cares about the people He's going to destroy. He says, as I make them like Admah and Zeboim. Question, okay, show of hands, who actually knows what Admah and Zeboim are? No. Because that's that. How can you make them like that? Admah and Zeboim, little known fact, are the sister cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, how many of you know what Sodom and Gomorrah are? No. Okay, yeah. Well, see, the thing is, in Genesis 19, when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, He actually destroyed 4 cities. But Admah and Zeboim were so unimportant, they don't get mentioned half the time. And there was actually a 5th city in the plain that didn't get destroyed because Lot begged and said, "Oh, it's a little city. You can spare it." And so God spared it because it was little. But Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim were all destroyed in the fire and brimstone. So He kind of picks on the 2 lesser known. How can I make you destroyed like them? Or worse still, just forgotten so that people don't even remember that God destroyed them. How can God make them like that? How can God give them up like that? When God said, "Out of Egypt I have called my son," He calls Israel His son. What do we do with rebellious children? I want to read something from the Law of Moses again. In Deuteronomy keep in mind, Deuteronomy 1, God describes Israel as His son. Deuteronomy 14, God called Israel His sons. Deuteronomy 21, God says this to the people of Israel: "If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of his city, 'This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard.' And then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear." Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that Israel didn't keep that law very much. Israel didn't keep a lot of their laws, but that one I think was particularly difficult. Because even God has trouble giving up His son, He describes here in Hosea chapter 11. When you read that in Deuteronomy 21, what God commands for the fathers in Israel to do to their sons, if their sons are rebellious and stubborn and will not obey, what does that imply about Israel, God's son, when they are rebellious and stubborn and will not obey? Suddenly it gives a whole new meaning to the question, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? Turning them over to be condemned to death. Now we see the true dilemma that God the Father is going through. Now we see the fear and doubt that might have run through the head of a man like Abraham, who was called on God to sacrifice his son. Instead of overturning Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, He overturned them. Instead of overturning Israel, in verse 8, my heart is overturned within me. Verse 9, I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. For I am God, not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. When I am God and not man, when He makes that statement, usually when you see that phrase in the Bible, it's when God is saying, I'm God and not man, I'm not going to change my mind. Or the prophet Balaam, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. He's not going to change his mind, Balak. Same thing Samuel said to Saul, God's not a man that he should lie. He's not going to change his mind. I am God, I don't change my mind, he says over and over. Here in Hosea 11, I'm God. I'm having second thoughts about this judgment. I am God and not man. Usually taken to mean God will not lie or change His mind, but here in the context it is God changing His mind. The gist of this seems to be that in spite of all that has happened, God's not going to utterly destroy Israel. He's actually going to try to save them. He's actually going to try to have compassion on them. What then? Verse 10, they will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, He will roar, and His sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. So a part of this story is about how they get put into exile, how God exiles His Son. Then this part of the story is how God calls His sons back from exile. Because exile is not permanent. The lion, the roaring lion, usually signals judgment. Like in Amos chapter 1 when God roars like a lion. But here God's the roaring lion who will protect His people, who will summon them back from exile and from captivity to make them one with Himself again. The silly doves of chapter 7 come like trembling birds from Egypt and Assyria. Return from captivity. Because as He said in the beginning of the book, I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And to those who are not children, you are sons of the living God. Now, how does He do it? Well, let's go a little bit further than that. Hosea 11 verse 1 stands at the background of what is probably one of the most interesting and controversial quotations of the New Testament quoting the Old Testament. Because Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I have called my son, is quoted in Matthew chapter 2. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2 for a minute and look here. This. It's the birth narrative of Jesus. Matthew chapter 2. Jesus, He was born in Bethlehem. The Magi, the wise men of the east, they saw the star. They came to Jerusalem. They inquired of the king Herod, we want to go worship the king that's been born in Bethlehem. Well, we want to go worship the king whose star we've seen. They do some research. They find out that the king was to be born in Bethlehem. Herod, in his mind, is thinking, I don't think that there should be another king. I think I should get to be king and we shouldn't have others. So Herod deceives the wise men and he tells them that, when you go and worship this king, come back and tell me so that I can go worship him too. And so the wise men, they go, they give gifts to the child, to Jesus, gold, frankincense, myrrh. And then they get warned in a dream, don't actually go back to Herod. And so they don't. They go home by another way. And Herod finds out, he's so furious that he decides he's going to kill every child in Bethlehem 2 and under. Slaughter of the innocents. And it's consistent with what we know about Herod the Great from history. And so what happens? Verse 13 of Matthew 2. When they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." That's a pretty direct quote of Hosea 11 verse 1. And we just looked at the context of Hosea. We just looked at what it said. "Out of Egypt I've called my son" is talking about Israel being called out of Egypt and then subsequently disappointing God. So, what in the world is Matthew doing? Jesus went down to Egypt and then He came back, and that's to fulfill prophecy. And in the context of Hosea, it doesn't actually appear to be a prediction at all. It's just a description of history. A recounting of the exodus from Egypt. And of course, Hosea developed that image. God teaches His son how to walk. He bends down to feed them. And Israel turns out to be a rebellious son. Justice demands that he be destroyed for his sin, but God brings Israel back nonetheless. Now, Matthew says that's talking about Jesus. And if Matthew had quoted that, there's a lot of schools out there that have a class in Bible interpretation or whatnot. If Matthew had been in a class on Bible interpretation and he had used Hosea 11:1 to talk about Jesus' trip down to Egypt, he probably would have been given a failing grade by whoever the instructor was. They're like, "You can't use that passage that way." But it's in the Bible, so clearly you can use that passage that way. From a strictly surface level reading, it's impossible to determine what Israel's election has to really do with Jesus' infancy flight to Egypt. So we're left with a couple of questions. Did Matthew not know what the context of Hosea was? Well, no, that's probably not right. Was Matthew trying to trick his audience? And, maybe they don't know what the context of Hosea is, so I'll just quote this random passage from Hosea, throw it in, and no one will notice. That what Matthew did? No, it's likely that at some point somebody's going to check their Old Testament and see, hey, wait, that's not what that says. Oh no, that's not what's going on here. Third option is Matthew did know what it said, knew that his audience knew what it said, and wants to get you to think. Think about what? And the fact is that the New Testament frequently quotes the Old Testament in ways that do not conform to conventional interpretive methods. That's why you have things like allegorization and analogy and dual fulfillment and typology and midrash and all those other types of things, which could be the subject of their own lesson if there's a request. But Matthew, what's he doing with Hosea? Well, it seems, of course, that the catchword, the word that he's using to tie everything together, is son. Because normally, whenever Jesus is called God's Son, they are tapping into an Old Testament idea. But that Old Testament idea is the promise to David. In 2 Samuel 7 and verse 14, it says, I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me. In Psalm 2 verse 7, God sets his king on Zion and says to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And over and over again, the New Testament constantly alludes to this by having God say things to Jesus like at his baptism. This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. In Matthew 17, verse 5, on the Mount of Transfiguration, this is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Or Satan in the wilderness even concedes this idea, since you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. And Peter's confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Matthew 16 and verse 15. The centurion's confession in Matthew 27 and verse 54, when the sky has gone dark and Jesus has exhaled his last breath, the centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. And the Gospel of Matthew opens with the fact that Jesus is both son of Abraham and son of David. Romans 1 talks about how he was the son of David according to the flesh, but declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead. And on the connections can go. The idea that Jesus is God's Son is tapping into a very well-established Old Testament theme of David and his descendants as God's sons. But in Matthew quotes from Hosea 11 and gets us to think just for a minute, what about Israel? Weren't they also called God's son? Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let him go or I will kill your firstborn son, he said to Pharaoh. He carried you through the wilderness like a man carries his son, he said in Deuteronomy 1. You are sons of the Lord your God, Deuteronomy 14. Because when Matthew does that, when he says that Jesus is the Son that was being talked about, he invites a comparison with the rebellious son Israel and the righteous son Jesus. Because both Israel and Jesus are taken down into Egypt by someone who coincidentally happens to be named Joseph. And both visits to Egypt happen in contexts where a tyrannical king is murdering children, like Pharaoh murdering newborns, or like Herod murdering newborns. Both of them have their own baptism. Israel passing through the Red Sea being their baptism. Jesus having his baptism, of course, in Matthew chapter 3. Both of them have a period of testing in the wilderness. Israel fails their tests, spends 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus succeeds after 40 days in the wilderness as the true Son that God had desired to do His will. So herein lies the great question. How will God save His rebellious son in Hosea 11? How will God save us, His rebellious sons, now? By giving up His righteous Son. The God who said, how can I give you up, O Israel, gave up His Son, Jesus, who had done nothing wrong, who had committed no sin. It's like if Deuteronomy 21 happened and, the family had two sons and one son was being perfectly well behaved and the other son was rebellious. They bring the rebellious son out for stoning and they say, we really don't want to stone this one. Can we stone our other son instead? That's what happens with Jesus. God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. Whoever believes in Him will not perish and have eternal life. And when Jesus is God's only Son, He's the only Son that did His will. He's the only Son that didn't have to be disowned. God called His Son out of Egypt. And that son rebelled against Him, disobeyed Him. What should happen to him? God called His Son out of Egypt in the New Testament. And this time His Son was perfect and obeyed Him. So what should happen to that son? Well, that son died to save the rebellious sons, us. Now we are called to be sons of God. See what great a love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called sons of God, and such we are. It says in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1. That's what's going on here. That's the message of the gospel right there in Hosea chapter 11. When Matthew quotes from that, he wants us to really think about how that chapter tells the story of what's about to unfold on the pages of the gospel itself. The Son of God, declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead. But it's so backwards when you think about it. One will hardly die for a righteous man, but perhaps for the good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through Him. Take out your songbooks as we conclude the lesson this morning. Are we going to be sons of God? Or are we going to continue to resist His call? He calls to us even now. Come out of Egypt. Come out of the place of bondage. Come out of the place of enslavement to sin. And come and join me. I will remove the yoke. I will lead you with cords of love. What's it going to be for us? Are we going to put God in the pressured situation of having to decide whether He should give us up as sons for condemnation? Or are we going to finally heed the call that He makes to all of His sons to come to Him so that we might receive His grace? You've seen how far God was willing to go for you. How far are you willing to go for Him? If you're here this morning and you're not a child of God, you're not a son or daughter of God, why leave it that way? Why not make yourself right with Him? Necessary to be immersed for the forgiveness of sins, or to be conformed to His will in some other way, to repent of what is going on in your life. You need to make your life right with the Lord this morning. Now is the appropriate time to let it be known. All together we stand and we sing.